Happy New Year, everyone! It's Robin the Delta Crafter, and I want to thank you for joining me for the very first video on my YouTube channel for 2024. Today we're going to be doing some embossing on watercolor paper. This is a very adorable, brand new clean rubber stamp from Spellbinders called Knit One. This is from House Mouse Designs, and I absolutely love all the detail that's in this stamp. It also comes with several sentiments, and we're going to be using the All You Knit is Love sentiment for our creation today. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and stamp my image as well as my sentiment on two separate pieces of watercolor paper. So I've replaced the mouse pad and the papers in my Misty with this clear sticky mat from scrapbook.com. So this is going to hold my watercolor paper in place while I stamp my images. So I don't have to use the magnet or anything like that. And I really like the clear design of this sticky mat. So as you know, or may not know, watercolor paper has two kind of sides. There's one that is very textured, and there's one that's more smooth. It's not completely smooth, but it is a little bit more smooth. So I started out by placing the very textured side of the watercolor paper up, and then I rethought the process and thought because this stamp has so many fine details on it, it would be best that I use the smooth side of the paper. So of course we're going to be embossing, so I want to put down some powder with my Rabbit Hole Designs powder tool and cover my entire piece of watercolor paper there with that powder before I begin to stamp. I use VersaMark embossing ink to ink up my stamp, and I close my Misty door and press down lightly on the stamp to get an impression. I went ahead and stamped twice, but I would advise, because of the detail of this stamp, you probably only want to stamp once. Now I came in with some black embossing powder that was in my stash, and I'm covering my entire design with that black embossing powder. And you can see there how beautiful that stamped image is. You can brush away any stray embossing powder with a paintbrush that you have on hand. So now I'm bringing in another piece of watercolor paper that I've already cut down to 4 by 5 1/4, and I'm going to stamp my sentiment at the top of that piece of watercolor paper. Now it's time to melt our embossing powder. I always say that I love to start by melting my embossing powder by starting on the back of the image, and that could not be more true when you're using watercolor paper. Because these designs are so fine and have so much detail, I spent a little bit more time melting the powder on the back and then switched over to the front and continued to melt it. By the time I switched over to the front, a lot of the embossing powder was already melted, and that made quick work of embossing or melting from the front. Now it's time to create our background. I'm going to be using two different types of watercolor here. I have a couple of liquid watercolors from Hero Arts. The first one is pink. And then I'm going to be using a couple of my Kuretake Gansai watercolor pans from my larger Kuretake set. I'll link some videos where I've used that set before so that you can see how I've used that whole set. So I'm going to bring in my water dropper full of water, and I'm going to just drop a couple of drops of water onto that Kuretake red so that it can start to liquefy that pan of watercolor. I have a palette here that I've used before, and you can see all the colors that are already on there. So I'm just adding a couple of drops of pink, that liquid pink watercolor, to the well that I already had pink in, and just mixing that up. Now I'm going to be using what's called the wet on wet technique, and I started out by not actually doing the first part of the wet on wet technique. And what that technique is where you wet the paper before you start painting, and then you bring in your wet paint as well. So I went back, added water to my paper, and you can see how this watercolor is now just moving very freely and across my watercolor paper, which is exactly what I want. I want to create sort of a tie-dye look for my background. So using the wet on wet technique is going to really be able to create that easily. So I'm just going to continue to drop a couple of droplets of the pink, and then I'm going to come back using a smaller brush and drop some red onto this background. I decided to use a smaller brush because the red color is much more intense, and I want less of the red. I don't want the red to overpower the pink. So I felt like using a smaller brush than I used with the pink would really allow that to happen. Now you can really see the watercolor effect coming into play, and I decided that I didn't even want to cover the entire background. I wanted some of the white to show through, but it looks as if it's very organic by using that wet on wet technique. The white is not as stand out as it might be in other techniques. It just all looks like it's very watercolored, water dyed, or tie dyed together rather, and it turned out very, very nicely. So you can imagine with as much water as I put on that watercolor paper, it stretched a little and bent a little, but we're going to place that panel under an acrylic block, and that's going to help to flatten it to get it prepared for when we get ready to assemble our card. So just place an acrylic block on it. You can dry it from both sides. That helps as well. And then you'll be ready for your next step. So now that our panel is complete, now I'm going to move on to coloring in or painting in our design. Again, this design is embossed, so there is going to be areas where there's going to be some resistance to the paint. But there are still white watercolor paper spaces that are left, and we're just going to fill in those with the paint. If your paint starts to resist, you can easily take a paper towel and dab up the extra paint that tends to pool on the embossing powder. So I'm just going to go through, and I'm using the packaging to kind of give me some idea of where everything is. So I'm going through my paints. I've put down the brown. Now I'm going through the red. I wanted the knitting to be red to go with our Valentine's Day theme. I'm coloring in a little guy over there that's wrapped up in the knitting. And I wanted the nose and ears and feet of our mouse to be pink. So I took some of that same pink that I used earlier, watered it down a little bit more, and got a very light shade of pink. Now I'm bringing in a little bit of a blue liquid watercolor, and I'm just going to color in up under the knitting or the yarn and kind of fill in what would be maybe a rug or the floor. So I didn't want that to just be stark white. So it's just giving us a little bit of a highlight of that area. I've given this painting a little bit of time to dry, and now I'm going to go in and fussy cut our mouse out. This is going to take not a whole lot of time, but fussy cutting is not my favorite thing to do, but in this instance I thought it was very necessary because I didn't want all that extra white space around the mouse. I just wanted the mouse and the knitting to be the focal point. So you can see there I fussy cut around that creation, and even around the blue highlight I put down below the knitting, and I really like the way this came together. So in my stash of extra die cuts, I had a couple of hearts that I decided to place as a little bit of a background to our mouse. So I was trying out and trying to figure out exactly where I wanted my heart to be. Once I did that, I just came in with some Artiste glue and attached the heart to the back of our mouse. That's going to give us a little bit more of a separation between our background and our watercolored image. Of course, you know foam tape was coming in, so I'm adding some foam tape to the back of the heart and the mouse, peeling off the backer pieces, and you can see there I add some really small pieces of foam tape to the areas of our watercolored image that would stick out. And now I'm just attaching that to our watercolor background that we created earlier. And then once I get that placed on, I'm going to add some foam tape to the back of that watercolor background panel. And I'm going to attach that to our card base. And once I've attached the card base, this card is complete. This is my first card for Valentine's Day, and I have to say, I'm still a little bit in the holiday mood. Are you? Let me know in the comments if you've moved on to Valentine's or you still got the Christmas spirit. I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. All of the products I've used today will be listed and linked below, as well as a couple of other videos on watercoloring. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Delta Crafter, as well as on my website, thedeltacrafter.com. Until next time, everyone, enjoy!